All right. Welcome back to the channel. So, oh man, this is going to be a fun one. Terence Crawford and Gary Russell Jr. have been going back and forth with one another. The last bit of last exchange that took place between Terence Crawford and where Terence Crawford responded to Gary Russell Jr. is classic in a lot of ways. Not just because of the smack talking going on between each other, but also how Terence Crawford winds up at the end giving Gary Russell Jr. his respect and pointing out what the real issue is here. Let's talk about it in this video. All right. So we all know by now, Gary Russell Jr. and Terence Crawford have been in a back and forth about the fact that Gary Russell Jr. wants a fight, and he wants a fight with anybody. Gary Russell Jr. is the 126-pound WBC champion. He is, I do believe, the second longest reigning champion in all of boxing. But for some reason, he can't get a fight with anybody that he wants to get a fight with. So getting along in years, over 30 years old, looking at the prospects of making, where the end of his career is coming up, Gary Russell Jr. reasonably can say, man, I need to get a big time fight and I don't care who it is. And if I got to say something to somebody, if I got to, make a spectacle in order to get a fight to pop off, hey man, what do I have to lose by doing it? Let's make this happen. Now, you first saw this stuff going on with Gary Russell Jr., or at least, one of the more notable examples of Gary Russell doing this was when he was trying to get a fight with Leo Santa Cruz. And Leo, who is the 126-pound WBA champion. I also think he's the WBA 130-pound champion. And he's getting an opportunity to fight Gervonta Tank Davis for a 135-pound regular belt, right? So for somebody like Leo Santa Cruz, life is good for Leo Santa Cruz. He gets the fights that he wants to get. He doesn't have to fight the people that he doesn't want to have to fight. So he can sit there and be quiet. Gary Russell Jr., on the other hand, does not have that option because everybody is ducking him, right? So Terence Crawford is, so Gary Russell Jr. says something about Terence Crawford, and he brings out, hey, I knocked out Terence Crawford. I broke Terence Crawford's jaw while we were in the amateurs. Hey, so let's fight. If you don't want to get your get back, let's fight. Now, this ain't the first time that Gary Russell Jr. has done something like this, right? He did it again. He also did it to Leo Santa Cruz, where he walked up on Leo Santa Cruz's father. I don't know where they were, puts his arm around Gary Russell Jr., around Leo Santa Cruz's father, who, by the way, has cancer, and videotapes, and it's like, hey man, see how close I can get to your daddy, see how close I can get to your father. You need to come see me because it's easy for me to find your people, right? Which is, a very thinly veiled threat, a little bit comedic, because we don't really believe that Gary Russell Jr. is, Gary Russell Jr. ain't that type of dude, like just where he's going to do something to somebody's daddy for a fight, right? So he's obviously doing this stuff so that he can, get somebody to talk about him. So hopefully he can get Leo Santa Cruz in the ring. He also, in one of his fights, I do believe maybe it was the King Tug fight, right? The last fight that he had, he actually put Al, give me Leo Santa Cruz on his back, right? So just trying to do whatever he can in order to get a fight. So he brings up this stuff with Terence Crawford. And I honestly, man, I like Terence Crawford's response. I like it. Now, again, I know that there are people that are like, man, this is kind of gossipy. He said, she said, he type of conversation. Yeah, and it is. But hey, man, I find it fun. And more importantly, you can see by dissecting, or analyzing the situation, that this is something that is caused. This is something, is a symptom, right, of a deeper problem. And that's what Terence Crawford acknowledged for Gary Russell Jr. when he gave his response. Now, what did Terence Crawford say, right? Terence Crawford was like, look, he laid out the scenario and he said, man, basically you sucker punched me, right? Because I was in a sparring match. I was sparring somebody and, it was really good. It was really good work. And you sparred somebody and it was really good, and I saw you, he said that he saw Gary Russell Jr. getting whooped by, I think it was Howard Davis. And so he says, hey, man, so Gary Russell Jr. started talking smack to Terence Crawford. Terence says, hey, man, don't say nothing to me. You don't talk to me because I just saw you get whooped by Davis. So what are you talking about, right? So now, these guys at the time are 17, 18 years old. So, they're at I think they were at the Pan Am Games, right? So in the Pan Am Games, I do believe Pan American, which would be North America, South America, right? So it's, I'm not sure where the Pan Am Games were at those times, but, very high level amateur tournament. So Gary Russell, where Terence Crawford said he turned his head to talk to Gary Russell's trainer, like, hey, man, get your boy before something happens, right? And when he turned his head, hey, man, he turned his head on the wrong dude. And Gary Russell Jr., he flies off and hits Terence Crawford. Now, Terence said, man, I didn't go down, or whatever. But what happened at the end of it is he said that Gary Russell Jr. wasn't actually in the Pan Am Games, but he was there with the team. And Terence Crawford was the number one 132 pounder in the United States at the time. But they sent Terence Crawford home from the Pan Am Games because they didn't want him. This is Terence Crawford saying they didn't want Terence Crawford to go whoop up on Gary Russell Jr., right? Because, man, come on, man. Terence Crawford is significantly bigger than Gary Russell Jr. And if this was something where it was a fight in the street, dude, in a boxing match or in the street, you got to give Terence Crawford the edge on that dude, even though Gary Russell Jr. is a great fighter, highly skilled fighter. He's just too small. He's just too small for Terence Crawford. Now, where Terence Crawford goes through all that, he hits the nail on the head because he says, look, man, I'm not going to try to disrespect Gary Russell Jr.'s skill because Gary Russell Jr. is a very skilled fighter. He's a great fighter, and there's a lot of people ducking him, right? And so, I can understand you trying to get a fight because these people are ducking you. Now, but to move all the way up to 147 pounds, it's like, man, come on. Terence Crawford said that he had picked Gary Russell Jr. to beat Vasily Lomachenko, but then Vasily Lomachenko beat Gary Russell's behind, is what he said. I thought that fight was a lot closer than it was, but still, than some people said, but still, Gary Russell Jr. still, big time outsized, even by Vasily Lomachenko. Anyway, Terence Crawford gives the dude his credit and points to the problem, which is that these people are out here ducking Gary Russell Jr. In boxing media, the boxing promoters don't say anything about it, So, like, on one hand, and I've been on this kick for a while. I've been on this kick for the last couple of weeks, and I'm probably going to stay on this kick because, it's all part of the bigger problem. If the boxing media does not insist or does not give boxers their due credit, right? Like a Gary Russell Jr., if they're not out there saying, this dude is one of the best fighters in the world. He's the one of the top couple longest reigning champions in boxing. This dude is an excellent fighter, undefeated in that weight class. This is one of the top guys in the weight class. And in order for people to, get to a higher, to get high on the pound for pound list, they got to beat a guy like Gary Russell Jr. or put Gary Russell Jr. on the pound for pound list so that his name, so he can be recognized by boxing fans as the highly skilled fighter that he is. And then that would make it more difficult for people like for Josh Warrington and Leo Santa Cruz to duck Gary Russell Jr. Because, the truth of the matter is that we shouldn't be having any of this conversation about Terence Crawford and Gary Russell Jr. This should be completely about Gary Russell Jr. and Shakur Stevenson. Gary Russell Jr., Leo Santa Cruz. Gary Russell Jr., Josh Warrington. Those are the guys that we should be having conversations about Gary Russell Jr. fighting. However, since the mainstream media won't give Gary Russell Jr. his credit, those dudes, with the exception of Shakur Stevenson's a young dude who, is early on in his career. This was his first belt. I'm not saying that to throw Shakur Stevenson in there with the Wolves like that with Gary Russell Jr., or better yet, I don't think that he's afraid of doing that. I'm not as harsh on Shakur Stevenson because Shakur Stevenson doesn't have a long track record of ducking Gary Russell Jr. Unlike Leo Santa Cruz, unlike Josh Warrington, unlike Abner Mares and all these other dudes that can't find a way to say their names. So since they won't say their names, Gary Russell Jr. got to do what Gary Russell Jr. has got to do to try to get a fight. And that's why I actually support a Terence Crawford, Gary Russell Jr. fight. Just the same way that I supported a Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Vasily Lomachenko fight. because hey man, if these guys are not going to get an opportunity and are not going to get the credit, for being the best in the division that these guys are in, then hey man, in order for those guys to make the living and to maximize their their career financially, they're going to have to move up to fight bigger guys. And so, hey man, even though I'm positive that Gary Russell Jr. is not going to beat Terence Crawford and he might get pummeled, hey man, as long as they stop that fight early enough and Gary Russell Jr.'s paycheck is big enough, I'm 100% behind it, because at a certain point in time, they got to pay these dudes money. But, I can't help but notice just the hypocrisy behind people that say that the little weight classes are underappreciated, they don't get the respect that they deserve, but yet they refuse to give the best fighters in those smaller weight classes the credit that they deserve, like Gary Russell Jr., like Guillermo Rigondeaux. But that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think. Hey, make sure that you hit the like button, share button, subscribe button. Thank you to everybody that supports on the Patreon, and thank you to everybody that supports in the live streams and as a channel member. And with that, I'm out. Peace.